We're out here in the gray. It's not that cold. We're in the car. There is a thaw outside. As you can see, there's snow, but there's a thaw. But the weather in North America, it remains capricious. It remains finicky. Just as the weather is cool, not as cold. Just as it's simmering down, and as far as how cold it is, I should say heating up as far as how cold it is, could very much get much colder tomorrow. Well, the topic of this video is not the reason I'm here is not to talk about the weather, but rather to talk about a 1960s novel called Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Now, this novel was originally a short story. It was written in the 60s, a short story written in the 60s, about, I think, 20, 30 pages. I haven't read the short story. But eventually, this short story received a lot of critical acclaim. It ended up winning the Hugo Award, which is a very prestigious science fiction and fantasy award. It won the Hugo Award for Best Short Story, and the author thought it was a good idea to make it a novel. So he tacked on an extra 200 pages and made a novel. Flowers for Algernon. The novel was published in 1966, the short story in 1960. Now, it's a science fiction novel, but it's not as much the science fiction, perhaps. It's not a hard science. Am I using the right term? It's not hard science fiction. It's not a science fiction in the sense of Star Wars, Star Trek, futurism as much. It's very much rooted in psychological research. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me just explain what this novel is about. So Flowers for Algernon follows Charlie Gordon, a mentally disabled individual who undergoes a procedure to increase his intelligence. He gets approached by psychologists, by researchers, and Charlie has a great attitude. He's got a good attitude. He wants to learn and he wants to help people. And he's living in a very simple job. He has a simple job at a bakery, and he wants to be very helpful and useful. And he wants to be smarter. So he's motivated. So he gets approached, and he ends up taking part in a research experiment in which they will do a procedure to increase his intelligence, and they will see whether or not it works. Now, this novel is told through journal entries. So Charlie is making journal entries, and you see the development of his intelligence through these journal entries. Initially, the writing is there are a lot of spelling mistakes, there are a lot of grammatical mistakes. It's clear Charlie doesn't understand many things that are happening to the world around him. It's very simple. But as he gets smarter, it becomes more abstract. He becomes more aware of what's happening. And that eventually leads to a lot of conflict throughout the novel in the later phases. Now, who's Algernon? Algernon is the rat that undergoes a similar procedure to Charlie. However, this rat has gone the procedure about a few weeks before Charlie, and essentially Algernon foreshadows what happens to Charlie. So this rat has its intelligence increased, and it can solve puzzles in the maze at an increasingly efficient rate. Now, obviously, that foreshadows what happens to Charlie. And spoiler alert, it doesn't really last. The process doesn't last of intelligence, of this increased intelligence. And it leads to significant issues even at the height of the individual's intelligence, at Charlie's intelligence. He encounters many interpersonal issues. He struggles in understanding his emotions and regulating his emotions. Before he had the procedure, he was able to regulate his emotions properly because he had a whole life. He was about 30 years old during the novel. He had a whole life to engage in this sort of mindset, in this sort of intelligence, and he was able to regulate his emotions, how simple or complex they would have been. But as he gets more intelligence, he struggles to understand his relationships with other individuals. He struggles to come to terms with his sexual impulses. There's a very significant psychosexual undertone at a few parts of the novel. And more interestingly, Charlie loses a sense of individuation. He essentially looks at his past self, he recalls memories of himself when he was young, but he looks at that person not as himself. He looks at that person as a third person, like almost through a third person lens. And initially it may become a bit jarring for the reader to realize what is happening. What's happening is Charlie loses a sense of individuation. Even as he gets smarter, he loses a sense of himself, because so much of himself is tied to his past, is tied to who he was, that he's wondering, who is he? Is he just an intelligent person? What about these stories? What about his life that made him who he is? On the sexual aspect of the novel was banned. It remains a book that is contentiously banned in certain American schools. It's one of the more frequently banned books in the American canon, we can say. And what else shall we talk about? And yeah, so an interesting part about the novel is very much rooted in the tradition of the 20th century psychological research. Watson, B.F. Skinner, even Freud play roles within this novel. They're not actual characters in the novel, but I believe they're all mentioned in this novel. And it very much comes from that imagery that we can recall nowadays, that imagery of operant conditioning with B.F. Skinner, Albert Bandura with the Bobo doll. These psychological experiments, these trend-setting experiments that we can see right now were trend-setting, but maybe potentially had negative consequences to the participants. It very much is during that time, and it's quite effective that Daniel Keyes, the author, captured that he sort of captured that sentiment, I feel. And Flowers for Algernon remains to be widely read. It continues to be a bestseller. I don't think it's as popular as it was around the time of its release. However, I think it has hit around 4 million, 5 million copies sold, which is quite an excellent feat. Not many books get to that many copies sold. The novel is very human. It very much has Charlie question whether intelligence really is is everything, is the be all end all, because even with his intelligence, he struggles to regulate his emotions. He struggles in his social relationships. And it just shows that this emphasis on intelligence that we have in our society might not be as what it's made out to be. So that's what I thought about Flowers for Algernon. For the most part, very good novel. I did feel like the middle part seemed to be a bit stretched, and I'm just kind of waiting for the catastrophe to happen, because the novel is very much veiled in a sense of bad things are going to happen at the end. You really get that understanding quite early on. It's not much of a spoiler, and it kind of leads the last chunk of the novel, a good chunk of it, to just be in this kind of suspense. But I didn't feel like the suspense was it wasn't as if it was building up to a sort of suspense. It was as if there was sort of almost innocuous, not as important plot digressions that happened in the middle of the novel. There's a sexual relationship that Charlie engages with, which I found to be perhaps not one of the most important or interesting parts of the novel. That really very much felt like something that was tacked on to make it a bit bigger. But for the most part, Flowers for Algernon is definitely worth reading. It's a very human book, and I'm glad I read it. Take care.